If a nation's future can be choked without firing a single missile, then what we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz may be one of the clearest warnings of our time. Many people are still treating this as just another Middle East crisis, another flare-up in a region long defined by oil, tension, and military pressure. But I think what is happening there now is much bigger than a regional dispute. I believe history may one day remember this moment as the point where China's economic vulnerability was exposed in the most brutal way possible. Because some waterways are not just trade routes, they are pressure points. And Hormuz is one of the most dangerous pressure points on Earth. I do not look at the Strait of Hormuz as just a narrow channel between Iran and Oman. I see it as one of the main arteries of the global economy. What moves through that passage is not simply oil. It is industrial momentum, price stability, production confidence, and geopolitical leverage. When tension rises there, it does not stay there. It spreads across Asia, into shipping markets, into energy planning rooms, into refinery calculations, and eventually into the daily lives of millions of people who may never even look at the map. That is why I think anyone trying to understand the future of global power must pay very close attention to Hormuz. And once we focus on that map, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. China may be a manufacturing giant, a military giant, and a technological giant in many respects, but it still depends heavily on imported energy. That dependency is not a side issue. It is one of the central facts behind the strength of its industrial machine. For years, Chinese growth has been supported not only by factories and exports, but by a constant flow of energy from outside its borders. And a major part of that flow has been tied to the Middle East. More specifically, a very important part of it has been connected to oil routes that run through waters like Hormuz. This is where the issue becomes deeply strategic, because the real question is no longer just whether Iran can sell oil or whether China is willing to buy it. The real question is whether that oil can move safely, consistently, and cheaply in a climate of pressure, surveillance, and disruption. The moment the route becomes dangerous, the barrel becomes political. It is no longer just energy. It becomes exposure. And once a country's energy lifeline becomes exposed, every factory, every refinery, every supply contract, and every growth target begins to feel the pressure. A lot of people assume that China's sheer size protects it from this kind of problem. I do not think that is true. Power is not measured only by the number of ships you own or the size of your army. Power is also measured by where you can protect your interests and for how long. There is a huge difference between being strong close to home and being able to dominate a vital maritime choke point thousands of miles away. In distant waters, logistics matter. Alliances matter. Surveillance matters. Air cover matters. Legal pressure matters. Insurance markets matter. The side that can turn the sea into a zone of fear without even opening fire holds an enormous advantage. That is why I believe the real struggle in Hormuz is not always visible in dramatic headlines. It is being fought in tracking systems, in naval signaling, in risk assessments, in rerouted cargoes, in delays, in insurance premiums, in quiet diplomatic warnings, and in the invisible psychology of deterrence. In the modern world, you do not always have to sink a ship to stop it. Sometimes it is enough to create a situation where captains hesitate, operators panic, insurers recalculate, and buyers start looking elsewhere. In that sense, pressure itself becomes a weapon. Iran also sits at the center of this uncomfortable truth. Many people assume that because Tehran and Beijing have often found themselves on the same side of Western pressure, their interests naturally move together. I think that is too simplistic. Geopolitics is never sentimental for long. Even friendly states put their own survival first. Even partners can apply pressure to one another when the stakes are high enough. If Iran feels that control over access, shipping, or escalation strengthens its hand, then Chinese interests will not automatically come first. And that is where Beijing faces another difficult lesson. Reliance on a partner is not the same thing as control over events. For years, Iranian oil has moved through complex maritime networks designed to reduce the impact of sanctions and restrictions. Shadow fleets, flag switching, relabeling, transshipment hubs, obscured ownership structures, dark routes at sea, all of this has become part of the system. This was never a normal energy trade. It was a trade shaped by pressure from the very beginning. But when the pressure rises high enough, even the most adaptable gray networks begin to slow down. And once that happens, the pain is not abstract. It travels directly into China's smaller refiners, especially the independent facilities that have depended on discounted sanctioned crude to stay competitive. That is why I think the real damage is not always measured in dramatic confrontation. Sometimes the deeper damage is measured in rising cost structures. One delayed shipment may not change everything. One turned-back tanker may not break an economy. But a sustained climate of uncertainty changes behavior. It pushes up freight costs. It raises the risk premium on cargoes. It makes alternative supplies more expensive. It forces refiners to recalculate. It pushes governments to tap reserves. It weakens confidence. And confidence, once shaken, is much harder to restore than a single cargo movement. If this kind of pressure continues, China has only a few options, and none of them are painless. It can buy more from alternative suppliers, but that often means paying more. It can draw down reserves, but that only buys time. It can redirect procurement strategies, but infrastructure and contracts do not transform overnight. It can also absorb the higher cost and keep the system moving, but sooner or later, higher input costs begin to show up elsewhere in the economy. That is why I believe the real danger for Beijing is not immediate collapse. It is gradual compression. It is the slow squeezing of its industrial advantage through energy and security. This is also why the United States benefits strategically even when the wider situation remains unstable. If Iranian barrels become harder to move and riskier to touch, then buyers who still need crude must search for safer alternatives. That creates opportunity for producers who can supply through established systems with lower political risk. So while one side faces disruption, another side can turn that disruption into influence. This is not simply about punishing Iran. It is also about shaping the options available to China and the wider market. In geopolitics, narrowing your rival's choices can be just as powerful as expanding your own. At the same time, this is not a simple victory story for anyone. Major instability in energy markets affects everybody in different ways. Prices rise, shipping patterns change, nervousness spreads. But even so, the side that can weaponize uncertainty more effectively usually gains leverage. And right now, Hormuz looks less like an ordinary waterway and more like a geopolitical pressure chamber where military presence, energy dependency, and great power rivalry are all being compressed into one narrow strip of sea. Then there is Russia, which in my opinion may be one of the coldest and most calculating players in this whole picture. Publicly, Moscow may criticize Western pressure and speak in support of its partners. But states do not survive by emotion. They survive by interest. If Iranian flows are constrained and China needs more secure replacement barrels, Russia gains room to profit. If anxiety lifts global prices, Russia benefits again. If Beijing becomes more dependent on northern supply lines and politically convenient crude, then Moscow's leverage only grows. That is why I think one of the harshest truths of this crisis is that even countries that appear aligned on paper may quietly benefit from each other's weakness. Russia's advantage is that much of its strategic gain can come without directly stepping into the most dangerous waters. When a disruption in one region drives up value elsewhere, the producer who can sell with less maritime fear often comes out ahead. For China, that creates another dilemma. Cheap and flexible access becomes harder. More stable alternatives come at a higher price. The choice then becomes painfully clear: pay more for security or accept more risk for savings. Either way, the cost of dependence rises. To me, this entire situation acts like a mirror held up in front of China's long-term strategy. For years, the world has talked about the rise of Asia, the rise of Chinese manufacturing, the scale of its export machine, and the reach of its economic ambition. But if a country's industrial pulse still depends on vulnerable sea lanes controlled or monitored by others, then its strength has a ceiling. A nation may dominate production, but if someone else can frighten the roots that feed that production, then the foundation is not as secure as it appears. That is why I believe the lesson of Hormuz goes far beyond oil. Today it is crude shipments. Tomorrow it could be LNG. After that it could be critical minerals, semiconductors, food corridors, or shipping insurance networks. The modern world does not only fight wars with missiles and tanks. It fights through access, transit, compliance, choke points, financing, monitoring systems, and strategic delay. Supply chains are no longer just commercial structures. They are tools of power. China now faces a race against time. It has to diversify supply. It has to strengthen reserves. It has to deepen overland alternatives where possible. It has to redesign parts of its energy security architecture. And it has to do all of that while continuing to power one of the largest industrial systems in human history. But these things cannot be fixed in a week or a month. Pipelines take time. Port capacity takes time. Contracts take time. Refinery adaptation takes time. And in geopolitics, time is often the most expensive commodity of all. So when I look at the Strait of Hormuz, I do not just see a dangerous flashpoint. I see a warning about the future of power itself. I see a world where sea lanes decide confidence, where energy routes shape diplomacy, where maritime fear can pressure factories thousands of miles away, and where nations learn that the map is still stronger than ambition. The country that understands the arteries of trade can do more than move goods. It can influence history. And maybe that is the darkest message hidden inside this crisis. In the new global chessboard, you do not always need to defeat your rival in open battle. Sometimes it is enough to squeeze the root that keeps his engines running. Sometimes it is enough to let him feel that every mile of ocean has become uncertain. Sometimes it is enough to remind the world that the power which can read, police, and pressure the seas still has the ability to shape the destiny of nations. I do not think we have seen the final chapter of this story yet. What we are seeing now may only be the beginning. But if current trends continue, then the Strait of Hormuz will be remembered not just as a place of tension, but as a symbol of how the future world order may be written not only by armies and economies, but by those who can silently control the routes between them.